Lastly, the third moment of the truth of enlightenment is the relation of the individual being to absolute being, is the relation between the first two moments. Insight, qua pure insight of what is identical or unrestricted, also goes beyond what is not identical, that is, beyond finite reality, or beyond itself as mere otherness. For the beyond of this otherness, it has the void, to which therefore it relates the sensuous reality. In the determination of this relation, both of the sides do not enter as content, for one of them is the void, and it is only through the other, the sensuous reality, that a content is present. But the form of the relation, to the determination of which the side of the in itself contributes, can be a matter of choice, for the form is something intrinsically negative, and therefore self-opposed. Being as well as nothing, the in itself as well as its opposite, or what is the same thing, the relation of the actual world to the in itself qua a beyond, is as much a negating as a positing of that actual world. Finite reality can therefore, properly speaking, be taken just as one needs. The sensuous is therefore now related positively to the absolute as to the in itself, and sensuous reality is itself an intrinsic being. The absolute makes it, fosters, and cherishes it. Then again, it is related to the absolute as an opposite, as to its own non-being. In this relationship, it is not anything in itself, but exists only for an other. Whereas in the preceding shape of consciousness, the notions of the antithesis were determined as good and bad. In the case of pure insight, on the other hand, they become the purer abstractions of being in itself and being for another. In paragraph 559, Hegel now is looking at the relationship between these two first moments of the truth of enlightenment, the truth that enlightenment is supplying, that of absolute being understood as something negative, in a way even more negative than the negative, as we'll talk about, and then this entire realm of sensuous being understood by the singleness of consciousness, the individual, and then we're looking at the relationship between these two moments, and that's what he's sketching out here as a third moment of the truth of enlightenment. And this is actually a good place to say a few remarks about, what's going on here. How can a, third moment be the relationship between these other two moments? And this is very typical of Hegel. It's also, Hegel thinks, very typical of consciousness. The relationship between these two, which will turn out to be one of antithesis, as he's saying, that is itself something that is being registered by consciousness. It is not something merely reducible to the two terms of the relationship. Rather, it constitutes a third aspect of it. So that's worth keeping in mind as we now move into this discussion. He tells us that this is the relation of individual being to absolute being. It's the relation between the first two moments. Insight, he says, qua pure insight of what is identical or unrestricted, he says, goes beyond what is not identical. So insight, you might say, is actually, in a certain way, on both sides of this divide. And yet, the insight that we're talking about is not the insight that, say, the absolute being would possess. At this time, the absolute being is really being treated as an object for consciousness, much the same way that insight diagnosed faith as treating absolute being as something that doesn't have its own agency, right? It will towards the end of this passage, though. So insight is happening, you could say, over here on this side, right? But it's going forth and grasping what is available on this side. So Hegel goes on and he says, insight, qua pure insight of what is identical or unrestricted, goes beyond this, beyond finite reality. Now notice the next thing he says. Beyond itself is mere otherness. Insight, as Hegel is constructing it here, is in a way self-surpassing, but self-surpassing towards something. Something that is also at the same time not a something, not merely a something, not a subject of predicates, because as we saw, this is a vacuum, or as he's calling it at this point, a void, right? It's an emptiness. And yet it has absolute reality. So he goes on and he says, the beyond of this otherness, it has the void, to which therefore it relates the sensuous reality. Where does the sensuous reality exist? Within the void that makes space for it. Those of you who are well versed in continental philosophy and reading this section, you may actually have been a little bit surprised. You might have said, this actually sounds quite a bit like some later thinkers. For example, like Heidegger's famous essay, going for a theme that he's going to treat over and over again, what is metaphysics? And the nothing. But here it's absolute being. It's not pure nothing. And of course, where is Heidegger getting some of these ideas that he has? He tells you right off the bat. He thinks Hegel's a very important thinker in the history of philosophy. Just didn't grasp everything that needed to be grasped about, say, finitude or history or the nature of spirit. But there is a similar dynamic going on here. And Hegel is not setting this out for himself. He's attributing this to the movement of Enlightenment and its emphasis on the sensuous, the empirical, and then whatever it is that is supposed to go beyond it. So he goes on and he says, for the beyond of this otherness, it has the void, right? To which, therefore, it relates to sensuous reality. In the determination of this relation, both of the sides do not enter as content. One of them is the void. There's no content in the void, and it is only through the other. It is only through what's on this side, the things of the world, which are all sensuously accessible to consciousness. So he says, the sensuous reality, that a content is present. That makes it possible for there to be a void. So there's not a void pre-things. Again, sounding kind of like Heidegger, isn't it? So he says the form of the relation, the determination of which the side of the in itself contributes, can be a matter of choice. We can go and emphasize either side. So this means that insight, or consciousness as pure insight, actually has quite a bit of freedom here. It has a certain kind of play going on that Hegel is going to sketch out for us as a good phenomenologist. So he goes on and he says, the form is something intrinsically negative, therefore self-opposed, being as well as nothing, the in itself as well as its opposite, right? We've got all these different oppositions. Or what is the same thing? The relation of the actual world, the world of sensuous, empirical realities and our place among them, sensing them, operating upon them, all of that is the relation of the actual world to the in itself qua a beyond. And he said, it's just as much a negating as a positing of that actual world. Now, what's he talking about there? So we do have a positing, a saying, this is here, the actual world. Objects, chalkboards, pieces of chalk, myself, the camera, you. We're all objects within the world. But we can also negate them. We can look at them as, you might say, their relation of not being what the absolute being is. In this case, a void. So he says this can be a negating of the actual world. Finite reality, here's the kicker to this, and this is going to be very important for the next passage. Finite reality can therefore be taken just as one needs. It's not so that we have a completely true vision of the world for a purely speculative purpose that we figure out our metaphysics. Hegel doesn't think that that happens really for anybody. Everybody's motivated by something to know, right? We can decide what we're going to make of this. Again, this is Hegel not speaking for himself, but pointing out what is going on in the Enlightenment and its attitude towards philosophy and consciousness and reality. So he says, the sensuous now is related positively to the absolute as to the in itself. And sensuous reality is itself an intrinsic being and in itself, right? The absolute makes it, fosters and cherishes it. That's one way of looking at it. The absolute allows the 10,000 things to exist. Some people will catch that reference, right? Then again, it is related, he says, to the absolute as an opposite, as to its own non-being. The absolute, you might say, threatens it, says, you're not what you claim to be. You're not truly sensuous being, because sensuous being doesn't even really have being as such. He says, in this relationship, it is not anything in itself, but exists only for another. Now, Hegel's going to draw a conclusion here. He says, in the prevailing shapes of consciousness, the notions, the concepts of the antithesis were determined as good and bad, right? Think back to earlier parts of the culture section. Here, what are they being determined as? Being in itself, being for another. Each of these can be being in itself, and the other be being for another. What is deciding it? Insight. That's what Hegel's not saying here, but what we have to understand as determinative. It is the insight of the individual in the Enlightenment who's taking a stance on this. So how is that going to be determined then? Well, we have to look at the next passages. Both ways of viewing the positive and the negative relations of the finite to the in itself are, however, in fact, equally necessary, and everything is thus as much something in itself as it is for an other. In other words, everything is useful. Everything is at the mercy of everything else, now lets itself be used by others and is for them, and now, so to speak, stands again on its hind legs, is standoffish towards the other, is for itself, and uses the other in its turn. From this we see what is the essence and what is the place of man regarded as a thing that is conscious of this relation. As he immediately is, as a natural consciousness per se, man is good. As an individual, he is absolute, and all else exists for him. And moreover, since the moments have for him, qua self-conscious animal, the significance of universality, everything exists for his pleasure and delight, and as one who has come from the hand of God, he walks the earth as in a garden planted for him. He must also have plucked the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He possesses in this an advantage which distinguishes him from all other creatures. For it happens that his intrinsically good nature is also so constituted that an excessive pleasure does it harm, or rather his individuality has also its beyond within it, can go beyond itself and destroy itself. To counter this, reason is for him a useful instrument for keeping this excess within bounds, or rather for preserving himself when he oversteps his limit. For this is the power of consciousness. Enjoyment on the part of the conscious, intrinsically universal being must not itself be something determinate as regards variety and duration, but universal. Measure, or proportion, has therefore the function of preventing pleasure in its variety and duration from being cut short. That is, the function of measure is immoderation. Just as everything is useful to man, so man is useful too, and his vocation is to make himself a member of the group, of use for the common good, and serviceable for all. The extent to which he looks after his own interests must also be matched by the extent to which he serves others, and so far as he serves others, so far is he taking care of himself. One hand washes the other. But wherever he finds himself, there he is in his right place. He makes use of others and is himself made use of. Paragraph 560 is going to appear, I think, to many readers as quite a departure because we're now moving into the realm of the practical, or you might say the ethical and the social, very quickly away from 3 paragraphs setting out in very abstract metaphysical terms what the truth of the Enlightenment is. But this is actually the culmination for Hegel of that understanding of the truth of Enlightenment. And it has to do with what we just saw in the previous paragraph. We can look at the things of the world and the void or the absolute in 2 different ways. We can choose which is going to be in itself, which is going to be for itself, and we're the ones doing that choosing. And insight is involved in that, so it's insight staking out a position on itself. Here, Hegel talks about the useful, the nützlich, right? Or Nutzen, use of something. And he tells us that whatever way we look at it, we are concerned with the useful at this point. He says, both ways of viewing the positive and the negative relations of the finite to the in itself are equally necessary, and everything is thus just as much something in itself as it is for another. Everything is just as much in itself as it is for another. So let's think about what the everything is there, right? We've got the absolute. The absolute is in itself, but it's also the absolute for another, the other of consciousness. The thing, piece of chalk, is in itself, but it is also for me. Not just for me in the way that I'm looking at it and I'm contemplating it. I used it on this chalkboard to do something. It's also for you in a certain way, isn't it? Hegel doesn't go into that, but that's something that we could, in fact, explore. And then there's me. And that me is something else that is in itself. I have being, but I'm also for another. And I also am for myself. So notice that consciousness, the human being, has a sort of prioritized position in this case. He depicts this by saying everything is at the mercy of everything else. Now lets itself be used by others and is for them. Part of being useful is being useful for another, right? There is no usefulness in and of itself. Usefulness is because something else can make use of it. So he says, and then now, so to speak, stands on its hind legs, is standoffish towards the other, and is for itself. And then uses the other in its own turn. So we really have, like when you think about the self and other, we have the self in itself, and we have the other in itself, 2 people, and each of them also has this relation to the other of using them, of making the other, or cajoling the other, or allowing the other to be for another, for me, for the self. And each of us can do that to the other. Notice that there is a connection here, Hegel says, between that standoffishness and retreating into itself and then saying, aha, now I'm going to use you as well. I think that's an important point there. So, he says, from this we see what is the essence and what is the place of man, the human being, regarded as a thing that is conscious of this relation. As I remarked a little bit earlier, the human being is a thing, is a sensuous reality, but is one that is conscious of being such. Maybe not in an explicit way, but is made conscious of that status. If I hold somebody responsible for the way in which they arrange the room or write things on the chalkboard, I am no longer treating them as a mere machine or as simply an animal, let alone just a pure thing. I'm treating them as something that has consciousness, has agency, can be held to standards. I am also using them in that process. So, what is the relationship of the human being to the self and to the rest of the universe? Hegel tells us, as a person immediately is, as a natural consciousness per se, the human being is good. As an individual, the human being is absolute and all else exists for him. This is egoism. This is the sort of unbridled egoism that we will see later people in the wake of Hegel, if not necessarily Hegelians, stake out as the Einzelne, right? So he says, moreover, since the moments have for him, as qua self-conscious animal, the significance of universality, everything exists for his pleasure. He talks about the garden, this sort of idyllic existence. Everything is out there for me, whether it be candy for me to consume and, like as sweet, or beer for me to drink, or trains for me to hop on and ride around, and the landscape for me to look at, the rain to get me, wet and cool my thirst, the bodies of others for me to take my pleasure in, whether through eye or hand or other organs, right? And we can go on and on and on, right? We don't have to multiply examples. Fireworks are there for me to shoot off and enjoy. So this is a sort of natural existence that focuses on satisfaction. He says, he walks the earth as in a garden planted for him. He says, he must also have plucked the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So he's referring back to the Eden story, right? And he says, he possesses in this an advantage which distinguishes him from all other creatures. And here Hegel goes through a line of practical reasoning. And this is one, again, remember, this is about the Enlightenment. This is typical of thinking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is saying, listen, all those priests telling you don't enjoy your pleasures, they're full of it. They're enjoying their pleasures in behind closed doors to begin with, and they just don't want you to have a good time. But don't have too good of a good time. Why not? Well, you might get VD. Or you might drink so much that you fall down the stairs. Or you might destroy your liver. And we can go on and on and on, right? So Hegel says we have rationality. Reason is something that we also use. We use the world. We use reason to use the world in a better way. He says to counter this, reason is for the human being a useful instrument, another thing that we have. For what? Preserving ourselves when we overstep our limit. This is the power of consciousness, Hegel says. Enjoyment must not be itself be something determinate as regards variety and duration, but universal. So what does measure or proportion then do? It has the function of preventing pleasure in its variety and duration from being cut short. Why should you rationally pursue pleasure? Well, so you can have more of it, right? So if you, let's imagine some really kind of simple things. I like beer. I like bitter beer, Actually, I like all sorts. I like, plenty of things that aren't particularly bitter. I have a wide range of tastes. I can't drink beer all day long, because if I did, well, I would drink and then be tired and go to sleep and wake up and be hungover and drink some more and never get anything done. Just live in kind of a haze my entire life, where after a while I would, really not register much more than the intoxication and then the bitter and somewhat sweet taste of the beer. And that's not much of a life now, is it? Right? I would have to forego other pleasures, If all I did was sit around and drink beer, imagine beer was provided to me as much as I want. I won some sort of contest, and a local brewery says, all right, Dr. Sadler is going to be the official, beer person, and we'll just have a window. We can look in his apartment and watch him drinking beer all day and see what he does. I mean, for the audience, eventually, they would see me turn into a brute. Laying around in my pajamas, beer bottles all over the place, ordering pizzas, doing the sort of activities that you can do when you're drunk. It means me watching TV and maybe playing some video games and occasionally getting up and falling down and things along those lines. Again, not much of a life now, is it? So he says the function of measure is actually immoderation. You engage in a certain amount of measure so that you can have more. It's to maximize your pleasures. Now, he then switches to talking about the social world, and he says, Just as everything is useful to man, man is useful to man as well. And our vocation, he says, is to make yourself a member of the group of use for the common good and serviceable to all. What do we tell kids? You need to learn something, learn a profession. No, don't read that Greek mythology. Nobody's going to pay you to do that. Go learn how to weld. Go learn how to juggle numbers, become an accountant. Take the business degree. Don't do the humanities degree. Nobody's going to pay you for that. Why aren't they going to pay you for that? Because it's not useful to them. As it turns out, we find all sorts of situations where studying philosophy, history, English, those things turn out to be useful. Like when you have a crisis or you got to make a difficult decision or figure out why you're doing accounting in the first place. But to many people in society, we arrange things in such a way as we're supposed to have a vocation and to serve society. We're supposed to be serving the other. And the other is us. We are serving those like us in the process. So he says, the extent to which he looks after his own interests must also be matched by the extent to which he serves others. So far as he serves others, so far as he's taking care of himself. Hegel says, one hand washes the other. Now, notice how he concludes this. Wherever he finds himself, there he's in the right place. He makes use of others, and by others he is made use of. There's a kind of arbitrariness to this, isn't there? There's no real necessity for why things are the way they are. Why are you a taxi cab driver? It just happened that way. Why are you a professor? It just happened that way. Now, that is not going to provide a lot of intelligibility. So that's not going to be the end of the story. But notice what Hegel has done here is sketched out this entire realm of the useful and how it fits in with consciousness.